Hey everybody, this is Professor Juan Gamboa hanging out with you. In this module, we're going to go ahead and review the indigenous foundations as we begin to examine the foundations of the United States. A couple of central questions that I want to provide for you is, what are the parallels and the differences that can be identified between the colonization of Ireland and the colonization of the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere? Second question for you to consider is, how did European settlers rationalize colonization? How would you describe their attitudes towards indigenous peoples and their socio-political impact? And the final question for you all to think about is, what was the role of culture and religion in the colonization of native peoples and native land? These are questions that we're going to be considering more specifically in this module, but we'll also be continuing to refer to these as we move forward in the semester. Chapter 2 in Ronald Stokaki's book, A Different Mirror, really begins to lay out some really important concepts in trying to understand a more multicultural ethnic studies version of America. In Chapter 2, he talks about the really important parallels that can be drawn between the colonization of Ireland, which really became a model for colonization that would then be used and exported to other indigenous peoples around the world. Too often when we think of colonization, we definitely can think of the Niña de Pinta de Santa Maria. We could talk about Spanish colonization in Latin America. And those are very, very important. However, it also is important that when we think of colonization, that you can trace this back all the way to Europe. And you can see how Europe also became colonized. And so when you're looking at specifically the case of Ireland, never forget that the British Empire sought to really impose its rule and authority over the Irish people. And to the extent that they passed laws, they waged total war. They passed laws often on the basis of religious persecution. And in fact, they really established an order that sought to put English culture, English history, English laws, English people above that of Irish culture, people, and history. And so you saw laws that were passed that were an attempt to outlaw Irish culture, reduce them to second-class citizenry. Wars were fought, land was taken, taxes were imposed, and it really became sort of a colonial model that we began to see being exported throughout different colonial sites when the British Empire was expanding its imperial gaze, its imperial wings. And so this is really important because it really does in many ways set a foundation to what begins to happen as they begin to interact, right? So again, before they had encounters with indigenous peoples, we can already begin to see that there was a colonization that was already set in motion. And then by the time they encounter, whether it's indigenous peoples of Africa or indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, there had already been a mechanism. They had already been years, centuries of waging war on other European tribal peoples. And of course, when we're talking about Irish people, we're also talking about the ways in which there were many parallels between their culture and the culture that they began to then witness of indigenous peoples of this Western Hemisphere. Some of those, of course, similarities meant that many Irish people had, they had diverse languages and tongues, but they also were people who lived with the earth, people who honored the earth. And in many ways, these were people that reminded them that indigenous peoples also had very much similar cultural markers, as you saw in Ireland. But from the English, of course, colonizer perspective, it wasn't just that these were differences. Their point and their gaze was about trying to create a hierarchy, trying to create a rank, to say that the English way is the better way to live. The English way is the true God's way of living over that of Irish. And then later, of course, you'll see even that over that of Indian or that of African. And essentially, it began to create an idea of the other. And the whole point of creating the other was really to create a hierarchy, try to attempt to justify and rationalize a sense of supremacy over other people who are different than themselves. So this is important. I wanted to share with you all a map that we oftentimes are not used to seeing. While you do recognize the U.S. continental state boundaries, as continental boundaries as a country, what you may not be used to is seeing the many, many different indigenous nations, tribes, and bands that constitute indigenous peoples of what is now the U.S., but for many peoples had in their language have many different ways to refer to their own lands. What we also know is that unlike almost any other group, the United States federal government only really entered into treaties with Native Americans and that of Mexican peoples too. And so in so doing, we know that more than 570 Native American nations and peoples have been acknowledged and recognized in those treaties. And this is there's an incredible diversity when you begin to really take a look at the indigenous nations, peoples, names, and cultures. Tremendous diversity that exists. If you look more specifically here in our case, for those of us here in California, specifically those of us here in the Bay Area, we are still standing on native land. And, it's interesting that this concept gets created, right, in generalizing all this tremendous diversity into just one category called indigenous or even Native American. It can be very problematic, right? This happens with other communities too. Think about the incredible diversity of people that are put under the category of Asian, or you could say the same thing about Latinos. And there's all this tremendous diversity that makes people unique, makes them special. People who have their oftentimes a culture, a history, a language that goes far back. Well, that gets flattened, that gets erased when we kind of construct these general categories. And there can be usefulness to that, but it oftentimes comes at a very serious expense, which is the erasure of specific identities and cultures. So I wanted to also spend a little bit of time for us to honor the fact that when we talk about indigenous peoples and native peoples of California, those of us here in the San Francisco Bay Area, in the South Bay Area, are still standing on native land. And that native land belongs to the Ohlone people, right, that have been here for well over 10,000 years. And it's really during the 1800s, especially in particular in and around the gold rush eras, that we saw the most displacement of Ohlone, but also other California Indian peoples who were not only displaced and dispossessed of their land, but in many ways were murdered through genocide. There was a point where even the state of California would offer bounties, reward for bringing the scalp of Indians, and the state of California would offer literal monies in compensation for helping to advance the colonization and settlement of the so-called Wild West. There's an excellent book, by the way, about this. There are several, but one that I highly recommend is by Professor Tomás Almaguer. It's called Racial Fault Lines, that really details, what happened to indigenous peoples of California, both under Mexican rule as well as under United States rule after the war against Mexico. And so as you begin to reflect and think about the fact that we're standing on native land, those of us here in the San Francisco Bay Area, there are several different sort of bands that are composed what are the Ohlone people. Those of us here in the San Jose area may be familiar with or maybe not be familiar with the Muwekma Ohlone tribe specifically. And there are, again, many different ones, but I encourage you to become more familiar and learn a little bit more about, whose land you stand on, and what was the culture that existed here for thousands of years before, we tried to impose this idea of Silicon Valley or even the Valley of the Heart's Delight, as San Jose has been known in other generations in the last century. And so, bear in mind that not only have indigenous peoples had a long history, a long memory that goes far, far back before there was even such a thing as United States or California, but one of the biggest problems, of course, that we face is the invisibilization, the erasure of native people culture, not only from things like mainstream media, but even in history textbooks, even in school curriculum. There's very little attention paid. I mean, again, I encourage you to reflect on the fact that when you were in grade school, how much did you really learn about the native peoples whose land that you stand on, right? How much months, how much lesson plans, how much curriculum was devoted to that? How many times did you get to go on field trips or meet living indigenous peoples and learn about their way of life and learn how they were stewards and caretakers of this land that you and I benefit from and stand on to this very day? And so I encourage you to think about that because many critical scholars have pointed out that one of the most powerful ways that colonization works is by not only the extermination of physical bodies to clear and take the land, but at the same time, it's either rewriting history or invisibilizing certain history. And so we see that as still a continued sort of issue that we still see playing out to this very day. Now, this matters, especially because when we're talking about narratives and the construction of stories and how people are being presented and what were some of the attitudes that were existed, it's really important to remember that those first initial attitudes between the encounters of Europeans and indigenous peoples, perhaps to many people's surprise, they were actually very positive encounters initially, in the sense that, if you look at Christopher Columbus's diary, you can look at Hernan Cortez, you can look at many so-called pioneers, navigators, but really they're settler colonizers. If you look at their initial impressions, many of them talk about the beauty of Indian peoples, meaning that they just give freely food and gifts, and they welcome you. And they're always willing to barter and to exchange, and they're always willing to give food and celebrate and treat you as one of their own, as family. And so these are things that had been documented in their own journals, in their own diaries. Of course, people like Christopher Columbus also wrote in that same diary that, because they'll give you anything, if, we can make them do anything. And he literally talked about enslaving Indian peoples. And so those initial attitudes were ones in which, they were not used to ever seeing Indian peoples in this way, indigenous peoples of this way. And so Columbus with the Arawak Taino people, or Hernan Cortez encountering the Mayan people, and then of course later the Mexica people, what is today Mexico City, oftentimes talked about, being so impressed. Many of them talked about the fact that they felt like they had even died and gone to heaven. They couldn't even believe if this was real, right? They're describing not just the people, but the land as if this was paradise. On the one hand, they weren't familiar with anything. They would starve to death unless it was for Indian peoples that taught them how to live on this land. And so there was these two sort of polarities, right? On the one hand, it's this Wild West. And at the same time, there's this paradise that exists that they want and they want to take. And so with those initial attitudes, you began to see the construction of the term things like Indians, where they begin to generalize literally hundreds of different tribes, nations, and peoples into just one sort of generalized category called Indians. And it's a stereotype, if you will. And these categories are always created with that serve multiple functions and multiple purposes. It flattens out and eliminates that diversity, right? Think about how many different languages of native languages exist here. And they all have their own sort of cosmology. They all, in many ways, have many different sacred sites. And what you begin to see with these settler colonizers is that they begin to sort of lump them all as Indians. They're all the same. And oftentimes when they said they were all the same, well, there were certain stereotypes that emerged, right? I don't want to deal with all that diversity. They're just a bunch of brown people who live here. And really soon, you also began to see the characteristics, racial characteristics that emerged in stereotyping indigenous peoples. And so on the one hand, yes, they were impressed with the beauty and the health and the fact that they'll give freely. But at the same time, they also began to label them as not just Indians, but savages, as people who were red, people who were barbarians and heathens, and oftentimes sort of using that, religious sort of biblical interpretation as an attempt to sort of justify, an attempt to rationalize, and even attempt to label them as ungodly people who had, who frolic and dance with the devil, so to speak, because they didn't pray to the same God, because they didn't use the same imagery, they didn't speak the same language, because they lived a whole different life, whereas, you can see there was, very different. And so the characteristics that you begin to see emerge is that they associated Indian peoples as being that of lazy, being that of cannibalistic. Now, that's a really important one, this idea of cannibalistic, because we have to remember that contextually speaking at this time and place, especially if you're thinking about the 1500s, even throughout the 1800s, but 1600s, 15 to 1600s, the church eventually took a position on slavery, especially when they saw what was happening with the transatlantic slave trade and the capturing of millions, kidnapping of millions of African peoples that were then reduced to chattel slavery. And the church eventually soon gave their blessing, but then began to have debates and mixed feelings about this. And one of the ways in which the church sort of not only gave its blessing, but then sought to, distance itself from the feelings of guilt, they said that it would only be justifiable to enslave a peoples if they were cannibals, if they were so ungodly that you would have to come over here to save those people and oftentimes didn't even think of them as people, by the way. They were oftentimes referred to as beasts and subhuman and animal-like. But the way that the Roman Catholic Church oftentimes sought to justify this was by saying that if these were cannibals, then yes, then the church and the empire are justified in enslaving and indoctrinating and in taking over a people and their culture and their land. And so, bear in mind that these are just some of the pillars that we begin to see. I know today a lot of people like to talk about separation of church and state, but in this colonial era, these were two parts of the same, two different sides of the same sword. You had the Bible in the one hand and the sword in the other, or the gun in the other. And so these stereotypes were really important because they emerge, number one, they appear to contradict the very first things these settler colonizers talk about, about how impressed and how beautiful they were. And at the same time, you have to ask yourself, why were these stereotypes created? Why were they lumped in such a way as not just to say Indians, but all of this negative characteristics associated with these racialized images, violent, excessive, the idea that indigenous peoples scalp and are wild, and at times they even tried, saying that, well, they're just, childlike. They're too kind of unintelligent to make decisions for themselves. So you need to have a great white father or the great federal government to come in to manage the land because they were so backwards. They didn't know how to really make use of the land. And so all of these were attempts at really trying to, rationalize what they were actually doing. While on the one hand, there was attempts to label Indian peoples as extremely violent. Well, what was actually being done to Native Indigenous peoples? Well, these are just a few. But you can see here that there's a very long list of acts of genocide as a perpetual, endless war. That was really the foundations of this country, the foundations of these encounters between European settlers and indigenous peoples. Not all, but eventually this was the most significant pattern that resulted in 98% annihilation of indigenous peoples. And so, yes, you do see things like violence, but you also saw things like lynching and terrorism, right, as a form of war being waged. And that should actually be scalping, but that's scalping and bounties that were being collected. I mentioned California earlier, but this was also done in Texas and in Arizona and in many states across what is now the United States. You look back far enough and you will oftentimes see that the state itself would offer monetary compensation to settlers for helping to, quote unquote, clear the land. And that meant, killing not only Indians, but then holding on to that scalp and bringing that back as a reward. And different Indians, of course, were given different monetary rewards for those scalps. That is, the scalps had different attachments of worth to them. And oftentimes it was the chief or leaders who, if you brought back their scalp, would be given great compensation, but also that of women, pregnant women, and even fetuses and wombs were brought. And so when we talk about genocide and colonization, this is horrifying things. There's nothing pretty about war, but when you're talking about genocide, it is absolutely atrocious and horrifying. And but at the same time, it's a truth. It's a foundational truth of where this, how we got to where we're at today and where this comes from. Slavery, of course, is something that's often not talked about, especially in the Native community or experience. Yes, absolutely. You can look back in history and you will absolutely see that many indigenous peoples were, yes, there was outright war waged against Native communities, but there was also many cases in which they were kidnapped and enslaved. Of course, you didn't see this as a great common pattern because Indian peoples who really knew this land best were really able to navigate it. They were able to escape and oftentimes navigate the land to safety and create a pathway forward. Family separation, land dispossessions, and one that's often not talked about, but it's very serious and very true, is the use of rape and sexual abuse as a weapon of genocide, as a weapon of war. There have been many instances in which settler colonizers had sought to literally wipe out bodies, but then literally by raping women, was an attempt to sort of wash out this Indian bloodline that existed here as indigenous peoples of the Americas. Torture, absolutely, witch hunts and mutilations and decapitations. And so these were practices, again, that we saw being exercised in Ireland, being exercised in Europe. And again, you can look at Europe and you will see that some of these practices, again, were sort of, practiced there, perfected over time, and then deployed against the war of India on Indian peoples. And so these were practices that had long been held, and over time, that culture of war manifested itself in some of the most, heinous crimes against humanity. And so these witch hunts, of course, you can absolutely take this back to Europe. You can look at even here, and you would absolutely see that women were oftentimes the target, but also those who were natural healers and herbalists, people who practice spiritual or different, religious, spiritual sort of cosmovision, were often targets of witch hunt for anyone who didn't conform with the traditional teachings that were being expressed by the dominant society. And so biological warfare, yeah, absolutely. It's oftentimes been the case that, some historians have pointed to the fact that many Indians died because of war, but then others have tried to say and suggest that, well, many of them just died because of diseases, and you can't blame a disease for going out of control. They didn't know they had, they didn't know that that this would happen, but it was just a simple product of two different people's meeting, and that's absolutely not the case. We do know that even when you look at United States military history, there have been documented cases in which military officers, sergeants, lieutenants, actually were given directives, were given orders to take smallpox-infected blankets and to spread them to Indian people, especially if you're thinking about the Mandan people of the Ohio River Valley. That's just one famous case where, it's very well documented. They gave Indian peoples smallpox-infested blankets. They were told to give it to them as if they were gifts of good nature and good relations. And they told them, take these blankets and spread them among your relatives. But the military, of course, fully well knew that these were infected with smallpox and knew that this would result in the mass deaths. And so, again, this is nothing short of biological warfare. That's nothing short of terrorism. That's exactly what it would be, a weapon of mass destruction. And so, yes, there may be some cases in which disease was inadvertent, but we also know that there are many documented cases where biological warfare was used intentionally and on purpose. And of course, there are acts of cultural warfare and psychological warfare. We'll explore that one in more depth in a different module. But, again, what we're looking at is that these settler colonizers essentially did the most unthinkable thing. I mean, over and over and over again for centuries, right? All of these different strategies and tactics as acts of genocide and acts of war. I mean, committing the most horrifying acts of barbarianism. Well, how do you sort of live with yourself, right? How do you sort of rationalize and try to, go about living your life knowing that this has been done to the native peoples of this land? And what we'll begin to see, of course, here is that in particular during the 16th, 17th, and even the 1800s, people who came into power began to talk about rationalizing what had been done. And in fact, if anything, continued that practice of genocidal warfare against Indian peoples, especially by the 1800s. So Thomas Jefferson is just one example, right? Oftentimes given credit as founding father, signer for, of course, the Declaration of Independence, and is oftentimes considered to be one of the greatest thinkers of and really sort of history makers in American history. And on the one hand, talking about good relations with the Indian peoples, respecting sovereignty, friendship, things being done on the up and up. It's kind of like doublespeak, right? Politicians be politicians, and they kind of speak out of both sides of their mouth at the same time, because Thomas Jefferson also was one to quickly propose the idea that he saw as the future of Native Americans was to either civilize them or to exterminate them. To exterminate, of course, meant to physically wage war. And you'll see a quote on page 45 from Ronald Takaki's A Different Mirror. He shares a quote from Thomas Jefferson saying that nothing will reduce those wretches, referring to Indians, nothing will reduce those wretches so soon as pushing the war into the heart of their country. And I would not stop there. I would never cease pursuing them while one of them remained on this side of the Mississippi. And we would never cease pursuing them with war while one remained on the face of the earth. My goodness, right? It's not about just winning a battle. It's not about just pushing them out. You're talking about genocide, because as you see this being expressed again, and bear in mind, he's governor of Virginia, but eventually becomes president. I mean, this is a man with enormous political influence, right? And so think about what was happening in their minds as they were thinking about indigenous peoples, and they oftentimes refer to Indian peoples as the Indian problem. They reduced them not only to the stereotypes of savagery and wild-like barbarians, but they also referred to them constantly as the problem, those who were in the way of progress, those who were in the way of modernity, those who were getting in the way of American expansionism. And so on the one hand, extermination and genocide was, the pathway forward in the future. And on the other side, they said, well, folks like Thomas Jefferson also said, well, we can civilize them, teach them to live in the ways of the white man, right? That means that they need to farm like we do. They need to pray to the gods that we do. They need to start reading the Bible. They need to start dressing like we do. And we'll see this in another module, but this is where we begin to see things like Indian boarding schools. And in their, sort of mindset, the key here with civilization, when they said to civilize the Indian, what they really meant was to indoctrinate them. What they really meant was to indoctrinate them, and what indoctrination really meant was assimilation, that they would essentially stop being Indians, kill their culture, but hold on to the human and remake them as good little white, obedient white men, is one of their hopes. And knowing that they would never fully well be respected or be included as white people, but the idea was to beat the Indian culture out of them and treat them to be subservient and compliant. And so think about this, y'all, because like here we are in 2021, right? And we think about, sort of the purpose of rationalization, and how could we still possibly rationalize the fact that we are still standing on Indian land? And I asked you earlier, how much did you learn about Indian peoples of whose land you stand on? Like, how do you rationalize the fact that, many of us are adults in college and we never had an opportunity to learn about indigenous peoples, the land, the language, the history, the connection, the culture? How do we not know about how these places came to be? And most importantly, what they actually have to offer, especially in these times of great, not only change, but great crisis. We are now, of course, beginning to see that there are many scientists who are finally beginning to respect and to honor indigenous peoples as caretakers, as stewards of the land today. And rightfully so, because what we, of course, find is that indigenous people's culture and land bases represent often at least 80% of the natural biodiversity on this planet Earth. So Indian control over land typically means better management of the bio-ecosystems, of the life support systems, because there's often a relationship to the land. There's oftentimes something meaningful in their way of life about what it means to be a human. And that goes beyond just a label like Indian or indigenous. This is why even places like here in California, where we've been seeing these outrageous and out of control wildfires, unprecedented, never seen this scale of wildfires, back to back, year after year. Don't matter if they're hundreds of miles away, the air becomes contaminated, polluted, and it still affects us. And we've seen some of these wildfire smokes travel hundreds of miles away. Maybe a fire in California, but you still getting, it's still, polluting the air in Colorado. Sometimes you've seen that even reach all the way to New York, right? Because at the end of the day, we are interconnected, and the air and water and nature does not recognize boundaries, doesn't respect human boundaries. And so what we, of course, have been seeing is that in these efforts, there's been a call to rehumanize, to decolonize, and to indigenize. And thankfully, of course, we are beginning to see a few politicians, but definitely in the scientific community, there are more and more scientists that are talking about the importance of honoring indigenous knowledge and their ancestral ways of being and knowing, because that's often a pathway forward. In Northern California, there are now not only land restoration projects, rematriation efforts to put the land back in control and ownership and management by Indian peoples. And they oftentimes have sacred practices like small controlled burnings. And when those are done regularly, right, fire, they call that fire medicine. And when those are done regularly, you're able to avoid these massive fires that we've been seeing throughout California and really throughout the West and really throughout the world, right, that are something that we've never seen before in our human lifespan. And so, interestingly enough, right, there are pathways forward because there's so much indigenous knowledge that's been passed on that's based on a relationship to land. It's based on an identity that's not just about genocide. It's not just about having survived that, but it's also about an ancestral memory that goes back older than America, right? People who were here before there was even an America, people who were here and who were part of an ancestral lineage, a culture that had been developed for thousands of years before there was even such a thing as California. And oftentimes those connections were connections to land. This is why we begin to see so many Native communities call themselves the people of the salmon, the people of the mountain, the people of the water, right? And because there's a connection, there's an oral history, there's a tradition, and there's oftentimes even original instructions about living in balance, about living in right relation to the natural elements and to the life-sustaining support systems that we are clearly out of balance with today. And there's oftentimes a pathway forward that in decolonizing, it's often an opportunity to recover parts of what it means to be a human and what was oftentimes referred to as recovering our sacred self, as you're going to see Maestro Jerry Teo referring to that. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to encourage you to enjoy the readings and check out the video clips and hit the discussion board.